Walter Hodges had, by every official record, no family. No children, no spouse, no next of kin listed anywhere in his file. When he died, the hospital where he'd worked for over 2 decades quietly prepared for an empty funeral. Instead, over 200 people showed up. Not one of them was related to him by blood.
For 22 years, Walter worked the night shift at St. Mary's General Hospital, mopping floors, emptying bins, replacing light bulbs in hallways most people never noticed were even dim. He wasn't the kind of man anyone talked about. Polite, quiet, punctual to the minute. The sort of person whose presence you register only once he stops being there. Diane Foster worked in hospital records, 2 floors up from where Walter spent most nights. In over a decade of passing him in hallways, she probably said fewer than 50 words to him total. A nod, a good evening, nothing more. If anyone at St. Mary's had been asked to describe Walter, most would have struggled. Kind, maybe, reliable, a little private. Nobody could recall him ever mentioning family, hobbies, weekends, or anything at all outside of work. There was one small thing, though, something a few nurses noticed over the years without ever quite discussing it. Walter would sometimes linger just a little longer than his job required outside certain rooms, usually the ones near the end of the hospice wing, usually the rooms belonging to patients who, according to the paperwork, had no listed next of kin. Nobody thought much of it. Hospitals are full of small, unexplained kindnesses that no one has time to ask about. Then, on an ordinary Thursday morning, Walter didn't show up for his shift. By the afternoon, hospital staff learned he had passed away quietly in his sleep, alone in the small apartment he'd lived in for nearly 30 years.
With no listed next of kin, the task of arranging Walter's funeral quietly landed on the hospital's small human resources office. There wasn't much to plan. A modest funeral home nearby offered a simple service, the kind reserved for those the paperwork listed as having no one to notify. Diane volunteered to handle the arrangements herself. She wasn't sure why, exactly. Guilt, maybe, for how little she'd ever really known about a man she'd said good evening to for 10 years. Or just a quiet feeling that someone should be there who'd at least known his name. The funeral home staff warned her gently, the way people do when they're trying to soften disappointment in advance. Services like this were often small. Sometimes it was just staff. Sometimes almost no one came at all. Diane arrived early on the day of the service, expecting exactly that, a handful of folding chairs, mostly empty, a short, quiet ceremony, and then it would simply be over. At first, that's exactly how it looked. A few co-workers from the night shift, the hospital chaplain, Diane herself seated near the front, unsure what she was even doing there. Then a woman she didn't recognize walked in, middle-aged, alone, dressed simply, sitting quietly near the back. A few minutes later, another stranger arrived. Then 2 more together, an older man and a younger woman, who didn't appear to know each other, or the first woman either. By the time the service was supposed to begin, the small chapel, built to hold perhaps 30 people, was almost entirely full. Diane stopped counting after she lost track somewhere past 100. Every single face in that room was a stranger to her, and as far as she could tell, they were strangers to each other too. During a quiet moment before the service began, Diane finally worked up the courage to ask the woman sitting nearest her why she'd come. The woman explained quietly that 11 years ago, her mother had died in that hospital, with no savings, no family nearby, and no way to afford even a simple burial. A stranger, she never learned his name until today, had quietly paid for the entire funeral and asked the funeral home never to mention who had done it. Diane asked the older man near the back the same question a few minutes later. His answer was almost identical. A different year, a different relative, the same quiet, anonymous gift. By the time the service actually began, Diane had heard some version of the same story from at least 6 different strangers, none of whom had ever met each other, none of whom had known Walter as anything more than a name whispered once by a funeral director who'd been sworn to keep it quiet. After the service, Diane made a decision she couldn't fully explain even to herself. She requested, and was eventually granted, access to Walter's small apartment to help arrange his remaining affairs, since no family had come forward to do it. The apartment was modest, almost bare: a narrow bed, a worn armchair, a single shelf of books. On the kitchen table, she found a plain, worn ledger, the kind used for basic bookkeeping. She opened it, expecting bills, maybe receipts. Instead, she found names, dates, small amounts of money, carefully recorded, going back 22 years. Besides some entries, a single word: paid. She counted them slowly, her hands unsteady by the end. 147 names. 147 strangers quietly given the one thing they couldn't afford to give someone they'd loved: a proper goodbye. Diane closed the ledger slowly and sat with it for a long time in the quiet of an apartment that had never once in 30 years held a single visitor until today. She thought about the hallway nods, the good evenings, 10 years of barely knowing a man who had spent every one of those years quietly making sure strangers never had to grieve entirely alone. The hospital record still listed it plainly, the same as it always had: no next of kin. Diane realized, sitting there, that the record had simply been asking the wrong question all along. Walter hadn't been a man with no family. He had simply spent 22 years quietly building one. One name, one funeral, one act of care at a time, never once asking any of them to remember who he was. They did anyway. 200 of them in one small chapel on one ordinary morning, proof that he'd never really been alone at all.